You're listening to the Road to Wisdom podcast, weaving stories told by wonderful minds about all things motherhood, health, intimacy, politics, nature, and everything in between.
Join us on an adventure discovering unique experiences that we can learn from to enhance the ways in which we live.
We are your hosts, Chloe
and Keshia. Welcome everyone to the Road to Wisdom podcast. Today I am very excited to introduce Paul Morland, who is an associate professor, demographer, and author of many books. One in particular that we will be discussing mainly today, which is No One Left, Why the World Needs More Children. And I feel like just that heading alone speaks volumes and would confuse a lot.
We have 10 kids between us, so we thought, why not get someone to tell the world that what we're doing is actually really good.
Yeah, it's the correct thing to do.
We're actually not weird.
Welcome, Paul.
You may or may not be weird, but you're definitely right.
Yes. Thank you. That's what we want. Validation.
Validation, that's all we need. I think I got very, very interested in the topic of birth rates because going to a private school and growing up in a very progressive area, the messaging that I received growing up was that there are too many children. And I remember I grew up one of four, and the school I went to, that was unheard of. Did my parents know what contraception was? All of the things. And how climate change and the environment and everything is being ruined by people having so many children. So when I did hear that actually we're not hitting the birth rate to replace ourselves, I was fascinated. And now I have lots of questions. So I'm really glad to have you here, Paul.
Thank you.
I guess we'll start with something that most people probably haven't thought of or may not be aware of, which is how the system currently runs. So, which I guess leads to why do we want to at least be having enough people to replace ourselves?
Well, when you say the system, let's talk about the economy, but it kind of, the economy is one snap, one take of how the world works. And I often give the example of Japan. So Japan reached 100 million people in the 1960s. And when it did that, it had a high birth rate historically. It had not had a long life expectancy historically, although it did by that point. So Japan had what we would call a normal pyramid, a normal demographic pyramid, not many people. If you take each 5-year or 10-year cohort, there weren't that many people over 90 or very few, more over 80, more over 70, and so on, all the way down to the sort of 0 to 10s or 0 to 5. It looked like a triangle with the top at the, with the tip at the top, a broad base. And if you think about the number of people in Japan who were aged between 20, let's say, and 65 back then, so people we can say of working age, because of the shape of that pyramid, there were about 8 or 9 people for everyone aged older than that, so at the top of the pyramid. It's a big, chunky pyramid with a big, chunky triangle with a small top, and 8 or 9 workers for every retiree. Now, when that happens, and that's what we would have called a natural, normal population pyramid. When I learned it at school in the 70s, that's what we learned. You had, as I say, 8 or 9 workers for every people of working age for every retiree. So pensions for those who were over 65, if you put it financially, were a very small share. Each person working had a very small burden to carry for an older person. Each person working, therefore, didn't have an enormous tax burden. And you can also represent that just in terms of the old people who were there were few in number, and they had many children and grandchildren. So the elderly, looking after the elderly was just something society did, whether it was covered by the government or it was covered by people privately in their own lives. Almost everyone who was old, and there weren't that many people, had offspring, children, grandchildren. Now, when Japan grew its population and then it started to shrink, and when it gets back down to 100 million, which it's on the way to doing quite rapidly, sometime towards the middle of this century, in 20 or 30 years, it will be back at 100 million. The pyramid will look the absolute opposite. There'll be lots and lots of 80s and 90s somethings and 60s and 70 somethings, people who were young back when that 1960s pyramid was drawn. And because they've had few children and their children have had few children, the pyramid is upside down. It's a it's a triangle with a tip at the bottom. And when it's back to 100 million people, it will have a little over one worker, so one person aged 20 to 65, for everyone who's retired, as opposed to 8 or 9 back in the 1960s. Now, I think it's a wonderful thing to live into old age, please God, with good health and happiness and surrounded by your kids. But I don't want people to die young or early, and I don't want to think of the elderly as a burden. But if you don't have many children and they don't have many children, then you end up with a society where there's almost one retiree for every worker. Now, you can move the retirement age, but if you go from a ratio of 7 or 8 or 9 to 1 to a ratio of 1 to 1, moving the retirement age a few years is not going to make that much difference. And that expresses itself economically in terms of the kind of tax that you'd have to raise to pay the pensions, the kind of tax you'd have to raise to pay for the healthcare, because, of course, the healthcare of older people is massively greater than that of younger people. You could, of course, say, well, the state won't make provision, people will make it themselves, but there'll be a terrible shortage of workers. The economy gets sclerotic. If everybody is working to keep the elderly going, living standards will be quite low, and there'll be little space or room for innovation. There won't be enough young people to innovate. The whole system gets clogged up. You can see that in the economy and the economic growth rate. You can see Japan's economic growth rate has come down and down. You can see it in the amount of innovation, in the number of young people who are coming up with new and exciting ideas, which, it's something young people do, not the elderly so much. So you can see it in the economy. You can see it in the science base. You can see it in the fact that in Japan, whatever provision the government tries to make, it can't invent people out of thin air. There's a whole industry in Japan of people fumigating flats, where someone who's got no kids or grandkids has died, and the bodies has effectively had months to rot before anyone notices they're not there. I mean, that's an industry in Japan. So, and then the bad news is that Japan is a front runner. It's not got the lowest fertility rate in the developed world by any means. It went below replacement, below just over 2 back in the early 70s, like a lot of us, like Britain, like North America. But the difference is it went a lot below replacement, and it's been there for a long time. So we're all heading in that direction. We're all now getting the sort of fertility rates that Japan had back in the sort of 80s and 90s. Countries like Britain and America and most of Europe that had kind of 1.8, 1.9, not too bad, and now down sort of 1.4, 1.5. So we're building this problem everywhere in the developed world. And more we're building it in the developing world. So India has now gone below replacement. Jamaica and Thailand, just to take 2 examples of quite poor countries, have already got to the point where they have fertility rates about that of the UK. France is slightly better. So the whole world is moving, and then there are exceptions. There's a big exception. A lot of sub-Saharan Africa is still well above replacement level. But I argue that having children in Burundi is not an answer to the problem in Korea. People live in nation states. Nation states may or may not want immigration, but they don't want effectively to say, well, we won't have any children, so we'll just take the kids from somewhere else. Fewer and fewer countries have that large fertility rate anyway. So I think this is a human disaster unfolding. Japan is ahead of the pack, which is why I've used that as an exemplar. And not nearly enough people are talking about this, and not nearly enough people are doing anything about it.
Which is why we have you here, because I think it's information that it's not well known at all. So it's good to start promoting it, because one of the things that Chloe and I have noticed is the number of women who will talk about how they wish they had children earlier, or they wish they would have had more children, or they wish they did end up having more children. They never actually were able to have the number of children they wanted. So, which is really depressing in so many ways, because we're looking at these numbers and the reasons that people aren't having kids is because, I don't know, multitude of reasons. And I guess we'll go through that in this chat with you. But the information that you share actually suggests that the plethora of reasons people don't have children from either earlier or as many as they had intended to are not really sufficient anymore.
Firstly, just to confirm before we go into that, when we say fertility rate, is fertility, just to clarify for everybody who's listening, if we say our fertility rate is 1.8, is that 1.8 children per woman?
Yeah, let me talk a little bit about what we mean by fertility. So there's biological fertility and there's demographic fertility. If a biologist talks about fertility or a medical professional, they're talking about whether a woman can have children, and people have fertility problems and there are fertility clinics. When a demographer talks about fertility, he or she is talking about the number of children women have. Now, they have children for a whole bunch of reasons. They don't have children for a bunch of reasons. And among those reasons may be biological constraints. So you may have a problem of fertility in the sense of a biological problem of fertility personally. But when we talk about it as demographers, we mean the number of children a woman has. Now, I just want to say a couple of things about that briefly. First of all, someone might say, well, why don't you use the term birth rate? And it's a bit of a technicality. I've got an appendix in my second book, The Human Tide, which just runs through this. And essentially, the birth rate's a very crude measure. It takes 1,000 people in the population, says how many babies were born in a year. So, if 1,000, it takes 1,000 because the percentages are very low. So, a developed country might have a birth rate of 10 per 1,000 or 1%. So every 1,000 people, one child is born. For every 1,000 people, 10 children are born. For every 100, one is born. And the problem with that is it's a very crude measure. Now, imagine you had two islands next to each other. They each had 1 million people on them. And they each had a birth rate of 10 per 1,000. So here you have two islands, same population, same number of babies born. So X over Y, it's the same birth rate. But in one of those islands, they're full of old people and there are very few young women having children. And in the other one, there are lots and lots of young women having children. If they produce the same number of births, then the one with a few number of children is having a few number of young women is having more children per young woman. So it's really looking at that, because if you compare Japan, say, with very few young women, compared to the population, because they're so old and they haven't had young children, to, I don't know, a country in sub-Saharan Africa, say Chad. You can't, if you're actually saying what's people's proclivity to have children, there are so many young women in Chad. You'd expect it to be much, much higher in Chad than it would be in Japan. So it's actually measuring what young women and men and couples are doing at a point in time and taking away that distortion, which you see in the birth rate of what the current population pyramid is. So apologies for that sort of slightly rambling explanation.
No, it's good
and
to
the
get
second,
that clarification.
the second thing I'd say is, whilst individuals have biological problems having children, at a social level, if you look at, say, Japan with a fertility rate of 1.2, or Chad with a fertility rate of 6, very, very little, if any, of that explanation and the difference has to do with Japanese women having biological problems having children. Now, people talk about sperm rate and so on. At the moment, for the vast majority of people in every society, if you try to have children at a reasonable age, and we might come on to what reasonable age is, but all things being equal, the vast majority will be able to conceive. That doesn't mean I'm not sympathetic to those who can't. That doesn't mean I don't believe the government and others should support in every way possible those people having children. It's just not part of the explanation, really, as to why fertility rates in the demographic sense are low. Except that where people delay and delay and delay, and they try and have their children later and later, in those sorts of societies, they're more likely to hit biological problems. And that doesn't mean that in the future there won't be a problem with sperm rates and so on. But as things stand at the moment, if we want to understand global low demographic fertility, then biological fertility problems are generally not an explanation.
Mm-hmm. I'd love to ask, actually, just going back to how we started the podcast, What does it look like in, say, 3 generations' time? So I loved South Korea as an example because they have an extraordinarily low birth rate, I think at 0.7. What does that look like in terms of, I've heard someone explain this, but like 100, say you've got like for 100 people, they create what, 30 or so?
Yeah, I mean, at the
people?
current fertility rate in Korea, South Korea, 100 people will create 33 children, and they will create 11 grandchildren. I mean, maybe slightly more. So that you get somewhere between, let's call it an 80 to 90% reduction in the cohort in the space of 2 generations. Now, we've talked about the economics of that. So again, that's creating that top-heavy population pyramid where you've got very, very few workers per elderly. So the finances of the government begin to unravel. You can borrow all the money you like in the world. You can't create the carers. There aren't enough taxpayers. And, it's no coincidence that Japan, which has had this problem for so long, has the highest debt to GDP ratio. That's the amount of government debt versus the economy in the whole of the OECD. So you see it expressing itself in government finances, too few taxpayers to support the elderly and their healthcare needs and their social care needs and their pensions. You see it in a general shortage of labor in the market. So it's very difficult for firms to hire people, and it will push up wages. It will simply crowd out a lot of economic activity because wages will become very, very high. And that's good for those in work, but it's not good if all your wages are then taxed away to support the elderly. And you see it, as I've already said, in the lack of creativity, the lack of new ideas. And there was a prime minister of Japan who spoke about societal collapse. And it's coming to Korea very rapidly. The only advantage Korea has is that it didn't hit sub-replacement fertility until sometime in the 80s, late 80s, mid 80s. So it's creating the problem very, very quickly. It's running its demographic bank account down very fast, but it has more tank in fuel in the engine, if you'll allow me to mix my metaphors, than places like Japan or other countries where we've had a very low fertility rate for a very long time. So you effectively see a population like water disappearing down a plug hole. And you'll see it in every way. You'll see villages abandoned, small towns abandoned. People will stop. The government will not be able to justify maintaining roads or keeping railway lines going. So I think people will tend to move into single conurbations. And the abandoned countryside will fall to rack and ruin. There'll be suburbs that are abandoned. Schools will close in huge numbers. You'll have to rethink how you do the infrastructure for a population that is shrinking at that incredible pace, and you'll feel it. I mean, from grandparents to grandchildren takes a while, but you'll feel that every year. You'll feel that sort of sucking effect, that dragging effect on the economy, on society. No one will be starting up anything new. There are no new businesses to talk of, no new schools, no new hospitals. The question will be, which bits of the infrastructure do we have to keep running just to keep the show on the road for as long as we can? A thoroughly depressing picture, I think.
When do we expect to see the effects of that? Like, are we talking our children, our grandchildren?
Well, we're already seeing the effects of it. I mean, in the UK, for example, we have a very sluggish economy. The whole of Europe has a sluggish economy. And that's because most countries in Europe have more deaths. In fact, almost every country in Europe now. The UK finally got there last year, earlier than expected, more deaths than births. If there's any population growth at all, it's all from immigration. So what's ailing Europe? Lots of old people, not enough young workers, mass immigration, much of it not very productive, a huge populist back sort of reaction to the mass immigration and ethnic change. If you want to know what's happening in European politics, in every country, whether it's France or Germany or Britain or Sweden or Netherlands, understand the issue of changing demography, mass immigration, which itself is the result of trying to keep the economy going when we haven't had enough children. So we're already seeing the result of it in London, which attracts, never mind what the London birth rate is. London is always attracting huge numbers of people. And yet in London, schools are shutting. So we're seeing the early signs. The trouble is that if we fix, first of all, it will take a long time to turn this round. And when we fix it, it then takes a long time for those kids to come through the system. So we built in a huge problem for ourselves. And unless we talk about it and do something now, that problem's just going to get worse and worse. And also, again, on Europe, the government deficits that we see, the fact that governments spend more than they take in, they're getting more and more indebted across the developed world. And that's because we have more and more pensions and fewer young taxpayers.
What would you say to the environmentalists who are all about, were you thinking this?
No, I was just going to take it in a direction.
Oh, okay.
Do you want me to? I'm sitting on something.
Oh, okay. No, go for it.
Paul,
We'll come back to the environmental
No,
question, no
it's
doubt.
the same thing, but I just wanted to address a couple of things because like I may be and we all may be running around with our blinkers on, but the general consensus is out there that we are so overpopulated, which granted
9 billion
speaking,
people.
we are very populated, but people are looking at that being like, okay, well, great, we're very overpopulated. We've got to stop having babies because that's causing the overpopulation. I feel like that's the...
Do you want to talk about Bill Nye, the science guy, who just said that people should be penalised for having...
reproducing.
Yeah, for having children.
But what I was going to say is, like from just taking away the data and everything, when you just look out, there's like the overdevelopment of almost every piece of land. And so it generally feels like I can understand why people are in this position where they're like, I just think I'm not going to have a child. And I mean, for research for this podcast, I Googled, does having children cause climate change? And it was like, yes, yes, yes. And yes, you should not have children or reconsider having children because of the, like the words are like, the language is like catastrophic environmental impacts of your children and your grandchildren. And so I kind of feel like we're all in, this is what we think because it's like there's this hysterical messaging and narrative that we are literally bringing children into the world that is, like it's like we're leaving this planet in like a hot disarray and don't bring a child in.
I don't know if you saw, but there was like the bus posters in Canada. I remember someone, like a photo on Facebook went viral over COVID, and these posters had a picture of a beautiful child and said the best thing you can do for your child is not have another one. And that's like the messaging that we're receiving. So in terms of environment...
Why do you think that this is the mainstream messaging?
Goodness, so much to go through there. So first of all, the idea that there's no undeveloped land in the world. If you look at the share of the world's surface that's actually occupied by people and their habitations and so on, it's quite small. And nowhere should you be more aware of that than Australia. If you looked at a map of Australia, this vast land mass with not really that many people on it, and they're very concentrated in small areas. Canada's an interesting case. I mean, Canada saying to people, some people in Canada saying don't have children. But then, they want bus drivers, they want doctors and nurses. And so Canada has mass immigration, drawing people in from very low emissions countries to a very high emissions country. Now, you may say immigration is good or bad. That's another debate. But if you're going to save the planet by not having children, but you expect a bus driver, bin collector, doctor. So in other words, you go out and you consume the labor of others. You're not having it yourself. You're drawing in to a high emissions country, a country like Canada, where they live at a high standard. They need lots of heating in their houses. You're drawing them in from very low emissions countries. You might be increasing an immigrant might increase his or her emissions 50-fold. So by not having your own children, you're simply moving people from low emissions countries to high emissions countries. You're not reducing emissions. The mindset is what we call Malthusian, and that is essentially anti-human. It's totally out of date. The number of children born in the world goes down every year. The only reason the population is still rising is because we're extending life expectancy. We can see a population collapse coming. I mean, no demographer would really doubt that at the way that global fertility rates are going, population collapse is going to happen in country after country. I think there's a sort of catastrophic mindset, which for some psychological reason I don't entirely understand because I'm not a psychologist, appeals to people. You have people like Paul Ehrlich in the 60s saying billions are going to die of starvation. They never did. But Paul Ehrlich, bless him, he's still alive, at least the last time I checked up on him, well in his 90s, still running around the world, frantically telling people that we're all living too long and we shouldn't be running around the world and we're all having too many children. So there's a catastrophic mindset which is feeding into this. I think a lot of young people buy into it. And actually, if you want a really thriving planet, then a reasonably young planet with lots of young innovators coming up with brilliant new ideas is going to move the dial. I mean, we are 8 billion living very relatively well on this planet, much better than people lived when we were 4 billion. And they live much better than they did when they were 2 billion. And that's because we don't have static technology. We have very rapid change in technology, from food production to transportation. Every aspect of our lives makes our footprint on the planet smaller because of the new ideas, new ways of doing things. You don't get that with an aging population. So I think people are deluded. They don't understand how rapidly fertility rates are falling. They don't understand the long-term impact of those low fertility rates. They don't understand how long we've had low fertility rates and how those impacts are already eating away at so many of our societies economically, socially, fiscally. And so, I've made it my mission in my little way. And of course, there are lots of other people in a similar, with a similar mindset. I mean, I've just been at this conference, this art conference in London, which is very interesting. Actually, I had dinner with Scott Morrison a couple of days ago. I was put on the same table as him, your previous prime minister. And one session was chaired by Peter Costello, who was a treasurer. And Costello introduced a baby bonus back in the early 2000s. And that had a really big impact, or significant impact, on Australia's fertility rate. If Australia's not in too bad a way, well, obviously it can open its gates to immigration. It's very attractive for people to come to. But also it has had a higher fertility rate for a period, thanks to Peter Costello's baby bonus. So I'm pleased to say I have very recently been mixing with a bunch of people. Bjorn Lomborg, for example, who I know has written some great stuff on that. Matt Ridley, who I met for the first time at this conference. So there is another way of seeing the world, I believe a more accurate way of seeing the world. And there are some great people out there evangelizing for it. That is my worldview, and I'm not alone, but I particularly am translating it into the issue of having children. And if we don't have the children, and if we don't do it for environmental reasons, we will lose our innovative edge. We'll stop coming up with these brilliant new ideas, which has got us to the point that we can actually feed and look after 8 billion people quite well. And we'll stop coming up with the brilliant new innovations, which give extraordinary promise of very low emissions energy, very cheap energy, a whole ways of living that could have less and less impact on the environment. And the last thing I'd say on the subject that we can keep discussing, if you've got any follow-up questions, is as countries become rich, they become much better at looking after the environment. The famous story is told of the wolf, the lion, and the tiger. Wolves live in countries that are wealthy. And there are more and more wolves. I've got a house in the Pyrénées-Orientales in the Eastern Pyrenees in France, and I've not seen a wolf actually, but there are quite a lot of wolves around. There were no wolves in the Pyrenees. They were sort of hunted out, and now they're back because you don't have a huge number of people living marginal lives in the mountains with livestock, where a wolf taking out a few sheep is gonna finish them off. I mean, their children starve. That doesn't mean that there aren't tensions between the farmers and the shepherds and the people who want the wolves to thrive, but it just wouldn't be a debate, and it wasn't back in sort of the 30s or 40s, where the loss of some livestock meant could be a matter of life and death for a poor peasant farmer. So as you get richer, as you get more urban, you move away. I mean, again, where I have my house in France, lots of terraces that were once farmed, marginal, small, very small scale farm. Nobody's doing that anymore. They're wealthier, they're more urban. And so a lot of land has moved back to nature. We now have bears have been spotted in the department. So where you have wolves and where people are wealthy, wolf numbers have grown enormously. The tiger is making a comeback because the countries that have tigers have been poor and have, until relatively recently, hunted them and reduced their areas to live in. But now that India particularly is really making great strides economically, particularly from India, but also Indonesia, other countries, they're able to make space for nature. They're being more urbanized. Their population growth is slowing, and but more importantly, they're becoming richer and more urban. And so the number of tigers in India is booming. Finally, I mean, it's been a more recent development than the wolves. The lion in Africa, however, is still under pressure because so many people are living very marginal lives. So the answer to this is not for humanity to take itself out of existence. It's rather, as people make economic progress, they become more concentrated, they become more urban, and they're more likely to care for the environment, and the environment actually improves as people lead richer, wealthier, more materially prosperous lives.
That's interesting, because one of the biggest reasons people don't have more children, they'll say they want more children and they don't, is because financially they can't afford it. And I do love your answer on this, so I'm going to let you take the mic, Paul. But what would you say to those who say they can't afford to have children?
Well, I do take that very seriously. I have my own children. I have 3 of my own children, and they're all married. They've all set up their own households, and I'm expecting my 4th grandchild. I hope there'll be many more in the pipeline. So I'm not at all unaware of the financial pressures on young people, certainly in the UK, and I know in Australia housing is very expensive. So I think we have to do everything we possibly can to make it easier for people to start forming families at an earlier age. And that means changing the planning rules. There's no objective lack of space. It means changing the planning rules. It means prioritizing helping young people onto the housing ladder. I strongly believe in young women having the same opportunities as young men in the workplace. Both my daughters are sort of busy working mums. So we need to think of ways to reorganize when you study, when you have your family, how you work these things into each other, and the kind of support companies and governments give you, the kind of support dads and grandfathers give you. So we all have to do our bit. But the idea that Korea is too poor to have children, when it's, I think on a per capita basis, it might be 50 times richer than it was after the Korean War in the 50s. So it's been the most extraordinary progress economically. And as it's got richer and richer, it's found it harder and harder to be able to afford children. And equally, if you look across the world, it's the poorest countries that have the largest number of children. So there's something profoundly wrong in modernity if, as we get richer and richer, we find it harder and harder to be able to afford children. It's something to do with our priorities. It's something to do with how we order and organize society. And again, I think of it as my mission to, and my book, No One Left Why the World Needs More Children, addresses this. Unfortunately, there are lots of other people talking about it, not enough, and not enough doing things about it. But we have to say, okay, we are wealthy societies. For most of history, our ancestors lived on the edge of penury, didn't necessarily know where the next meal or the meal after that was going to come from. If there was a bad famine, a bad harvest or a famine, they'd have to move, get on a ship or get on a boat, or on a train if there were trains, or somehow find some way of keeping their families alive. And in those circumstances, it's true, they didn't have great methods, modern methods of controlling their fertility, but still they had children. So have we got to the point that we're so wealthy and we say we want children? We're wealthy as societies, but we feel poor and we feel that we just can't afford to have children. So I think it's a two-pronged attack. On the one hand, we need to do everything we possibly can to help young 20 and young 30-somethings to start having families and to have larger families. At the same time, we need to remind everybody that we need some perspective here, and that without children, there will be no economy in the future. So we need to reorder society, reorder the economy, and reorder our priorities to put children back at the center.
I mean, that sounds fabulous. But how would, logistically and practically speaking, Keshia and I are now mid to late 30s. We have 5 kids and we are very unusual. Not so much in our area, but globally.
In general. Even just in like Australia.
In Australia, but especially overseas. Like you've been to Europe recently, Italy, and I've lived in Canada, and I am like a walking zoo. You are
It's
pretty
fantastic.
much the same.
Actually,
it's fantastic. You get a lot of attention.
yeah.
A lot of attention.
Going to Italy, I feel like the nonnas are starved for bambinis. So
Yes.
we were just inundated with nonnas.
But I mean, like, how do we? I mean, like, how, as a, you know, like we're young, how would it look logistically, or to, you know, we were to make change? How do we actually change this? Like, how do we actually put things into place? Because it's great to know this information, but it's still cost $1 million to buy a house around here, and people are stuck on that, or like they feel like they need to do X, Y, Z before having children. There's no grandparents, there's no aunts, there's no uncles, there's no like, it feels like we're very stuck, but we've got the data, but what do we do?
Well, the first thing to do is to recognize we've had this problem now for 50 years of too few children, and that we're not going to turn it round overnight. The second thing is to recognize that a whole range of things are going to be needed, and they'll be different in different countries, and they'll be different over time, and you've got to experiment. You've got to try different things. But the third thing is it would be great if it were acknowledged as a problem by the politicians. And the politicians started doing something, and it would be great if people on the ground, the public, understood it, young people understood it, and were no longer in the thrall of this anti-human ideology of the environment. So first of all, we need to change hearts and minds. And again, I'm doing my little bit on this podcast and lots of other podcasts, broadcast and writing. And everyone can play their part in that. We need to do things as individuals. So, you know, my wife and I spend a lot of time helping our kids with our grandchildren. And that's kind of part of the compact that we want to have grandchildren. They're the greatest happiness of our lives. And it's really a win-win-win. It's great for the kids to have grandparents around. I certainly hugely appreciated having mine. It's great for the parents because they're busy working parents, and it's extra free, loving, reliable, secure care for the children. And it's wonderful for us. It's the best thing in our lives. Our grandchildren, the best things in our lives at the moment. And, you know, I'm hoping we'll have some more, and they'll be there with us and for us. So my mother, who's 91, has 7 grandchildren. It's not a huge number, 2 children, 7 grandchildren. And they flock round her. They go round, they see her, they have dinner with her, because she was a great grandma when they were little. And it's not like we owe her. It's just they love her, and she's a huge part of their life. So we can all do our bit. Aunts and uncles can do their bit. But I think the government, so there's a whole range of things. We need to change housing. So there's absolutely no reason housing in Australia or London should be so expensive. It's all about planning. It's all about regulations. It's all about NIMBYism. So that's one thing. You know, we should be building, we should be expanding as we were in the 50s and 60s when we had the baby boom, and making housing affordable to people. It absolutely does not need to be unaffordable. We should be subsidizing childcare because young women, thank goodness, are getting great educations and want great careers. We need to help them combine those great careers and those great educations with having children and creating a future for our societies. So there's a real role for government, and there are different things the government can do. So one thing the government should do is acknowledge the issue. In Britain, we've never had a frontline politician who's acknowledged the issue or talked about it. And our prime minister's actually going backwards and saying, oh, it's nothing to do with me. I mean, he and his chancellor just don't understand. They do not understand how demography is the fundamental problem they don't seem to be able to fix economically. I think governments can change the culture, but they can change the tax regime. So I wrote an article for the Sunday Times a few years ago saying we should have lower taxes for people with kids. And if the government can't afford it because it's got fiscal problems, then change the tax rate, have differential, it could be fiscally neutral. And the Sunday Times chose to entitle the article, "Is it time to tax the childless?" But I think it's fair to say, we have benefits for people with kids, whether it's the baby bonus or family allowance, whatever you call it. Why not reflect it in the tax system? And that if that means having a differential tax for those who are with or without children, to acknowledge the fact that those with children are creating a demographic future for the country, meaning that there will be an economy in 20, 30, 40 years' time. And if we can't afford to do that because we're already running deficits or whatever, then just do it in a fiscally neutral way. And that will mean higher taxes for people and lower taxes for other people. The way we build is very important, that we don't overly densify our cities, that we actually build family housing, not just, if we could afford to build family housing in Britain in the 1930s en masse, which is where I was brought up, a small 3-bedroom semi-detached house with a nice sized garden for my sister and me to run around in. I mean, we could do that in the 30s. We can certainly do it now. There's no objective lack of space. You can put in the transport system that people can commute. You've got much better means now of working remotely, which means you can live further away and maybe not travel into the office 5 days a week. The whole range of technological changes and advance in economy, which means it's crazy we can't build plenty of family housing. I could go on and on. There are loads and loads of ideas about how, you could give, in Central Asia, Mongolia, they give medals for mothers. Now, that may not work in the West,
I will take the tax cut and the medal. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, if we could pay less tax in my family, that'd be great.
Can we just walk around with 5 medals around our necks?
In the article, I mentioned, people get telegrams from the Queen. The Queen was still, Her Majesty, the Queen was still alive in those days. When they reached the age of 100, why not get a telegram from the Queen when you have your 5th child, and that may or may not motivate people.
Well, to add to this though, I think I listened to Konstantin Christen.
I just did an interview with him. It's not out yet, but I did trigonometry.
Oh, I love trigonometry. So I'm excited to listen.
And Konstantin Christen was also at this conference that I was.
Oh, fantastic! Well, he spoke about it recently, I think, on Chris Williamson's podcast, if I remember correctly. And he was saying that in Hungary, there are tax cuts for women for every child they have. If you have 3 children, you don't pay income tax for life. And I feel like that would be a very quick solution in Australia to this problem.
But is it the women or the men don't pay, or the family?
The woman. So,
the woman's looking after the children. So,
yeah, not in all cases.
They're doing a lot in Hungary. They're working very hard at it. I mean, one of the things you have in Hungary is loans for homes. When you say you want a family, and then the loan gets written off as you have more children. Now, all of this is very expensive. But if we want an economy in the future, I think we need completely to rethink our welfare state, our tax and spend, and reorient them towards the need to have an economic future. Because if you don't, you live from year to year or fiscal period to fiscal period. And you just find imagine the impact on the economy over a couple of generations if you're losing sort of 85% of your people. So I think the whole way we run our family policies, our welfare states, our tax and spend, the whole way the state, there's a limit to what the state can do, and it's not just down to the state. The penultimate chapter of my book was what government can do for us. And then my last chapter is what we can do for ourselves. The government needs to be pushing at an open door. It needs to be pushing at a society that wants to embrace this. So it's not all down to government, but we need completely to rethink our welfare state to make it a family welfare state and organize it around people having children, supporting people having children, supporting women having careers and having families. So yes, it sounds expensive, and it will be expensive, but it needs to be the way we orient the whole of our tax and spend instead of a sort of add-on. It's a kind of redesign. And if we do that and we get young children, we get a buoyant number of young workers entering the workforce, then eventually we'll find we can be less reliant on the state over the long term.
Yeah. Oh, and I'd like to go into that actually, because I feel like there is a lot of cultural change that needs to occur. And I've followed Stephen J. Shaw's work for a little while now too. And
he was also at the conference.
Yes,
it was a.
I feel like I should have been at that conference.
You should have been at the conference. It was the art conference. It was Monday to Wednesday this week in London. Yeah.
Oh, I could have brought my 5 kids and been like, look, I'm doing my part. But listening to Stephen J. Shaw, he does go into the emotional aspect of children, of having children and having families. And one thing I don't actually think I've heard anyone mention is that we're encouraging women to go career first and start family later. in that our parents are older when we start our families and starting to get to the age where they become independent, and then we're having children who are dependents. And so now as the maker of money,
Middle. Yes, the middle.
the middle, yeah, you're looking after
The
two
stressed
dependents.
middle.
Yes, whereas if we encouraged women to start their families earlier, because education is something that you can continue doing for life, and a career is something, I think, because we're living so long, he mentions that you can have 3, 4, 5 careers within your lifetime. But yeah, where we hopefully to see a cultural shift so that we're encouraging women to have children earlier. Our parents are still young enough to be able to help us, and then when our parents are older, our children are young enough to help us with them. So it's
which makes the most sense, especially with what we talk about on our podcast with being present mothers and kind of not shipping the kids off to daycare at 3 months old like they do in North America, to go back to the workforce. It just kind of, it seems like the perfect kind of fitting shoe.
Well, I think you put your finger on a few interesting things. So first of all, we have this very fixed idea about education. You go to school, then you go to university, and maybe you think about doing a master's, and you go off for a gap year, and then you finish your master's and maybe a PhD, and then maybe you'll try a job, and then you don't like it, and do another year around the world, and then by the time you're about 37, if you're lucky, you settle down, think about having a child. So all those things are wonderful, but we need to change the order they happen. At least give people the options and opportunities. So, for example, why not write off debt or not let people, why not pay for people's studies if they already have a child or two? Provide the kind of childcare. So again, I'm not just saying throw money at the problem, but you change the way you raise and spend your money to focus it around people having children. I think it's great to have them relatively young. I mean, I wasn't that young. We were in our late 20s, early 30s. But the great thing is so my children similarly. So when we had our kids, my mum was like 60. And now when our grandchildren were born, we were in our late 50s, early 60s. And hopefully we've got years ahead when we can look after small children. And as we get a bit older and a bit less able to get down on the floor, they're getting older. So, I mean, the other thing is in China, where they had a one-child policy, you've got lots of couples who've got aging and elderly parents, and they have, you have a couple with 4 elderly parents, and they're both only children. So they've got no one to share that work with. So it's then very difficult to have children. Now, when you're old, I know it's a very, very long time ahead. There are going to be 5 kids, and maybe more. I don't know, 5 kids figuring out how to help, and the whole family dynamic works much better if there's not too big a gap between the generations, and if families are reasonably sized, even just having one sibling, as I have, to help think about how we look after mom and what she needs, and the fact that there are 7 grandchildren. I mean, it totally changes the environment. If you're a Chinese couple, your parents were forced only to have one child. And I mean, it does take time and care to look after elderly people. And in fact, as our societies age, the state simply won't be able to look after the elderly to the same extent. And so more and more will fall on the kids. And if there aren't kids, the elderly will just sit alone and, get old and ill and die without the care, because the care simply won't be there. Now, I've never said have children so we can do elder care. I've always said the most important reason to have children is they're the most fantastic, wonderful thing in the world. But the reason I write and focus on the sort of economic and fiscal and social aspects is because those are quite hard, mathematical, quantitative issues. But it might end up like I'm sounding to say have children because it kind of fits into making the society and the economy work. That's not the primary reason for having children. The primary reason for having children is that you get 2 people coming together, and at the end of the process, you get a unique individual, which is just marvelous. And most parents would say that having kids is the most life-enhancing thing. But you can get poetic, but actually, if you want to talk about hard facts, it drives you more towards talking about economics and support. But we absolutely do need to think quite radically about how we organize education. Another point you made, which I think is a very good one, is we are going to work very long lives, working lives, and we are going to change what we do because technology is changing so fast. We'll have many careers probably, and we'll have to retrain all the time. So the idea that you get all your education up front, you get a job, and then you hack away at it till you're 60, that's very 1950s, 1960s maybe. It's just not the way the world is going to work in your generation, or even it has worked in my generation. I worked for 6 years and I did a master's and I changed direction in career, and then I did a PhD part-time when my kids left primary school. There are a whole range of things. And you can't just get all your education in up front and then, do your job for the next sort of 30 or 40 years. So if that's the case, let's think about creative ways that we can fit education, stimulating and meaningful and remunerative careers around the biological constraints. Now, those biological constraints are shifting. The technology helps people have children later, but the technology is still not completely reliable. So, trying to have a kid in your early 40s with IVF is still much, much, much less reliable than trying to have children in your 20s by natural means. It's less painful, it's less expensive. There's a whole range of reasons that doing that is not great. And the other reason why doing it is not great, and again, you put your finger on it, is if the generations are too spaced out, then it's difficult to care for them. So just to give you an example, a very good friend of mine just lost her father, and her mother, she's an only child. Her parents couldn't have more than one child. I know they would have liked to, because her mother told me that there was a problem. So all the burden of her parents were on her. And she, the same age as me, had a child young, and her child has had a child. And so my friend is caught between looking after her parents and helping out with her grandchild, soon to be grandchildren. And that's tough, but it's very different from looking after your elderly parents and looking after your own kids. Because any help she can give to her daughter, she will do, and she'll be there for her. But it's not like the primary care responsibility you'd have if you were the parent. So the fact that she's dealing with elderly parents and a grandchild, not elderly parents and her own children, and I'm in the same position, although I've got siblings to share it with, etc., etc. But that's the position you want to be in when you're looking after your really elderly parents. You should be trying to struggle and sort of find the time to help with your grandchildren. If you actually have that primary responsibility for your children and you're trying to make a career and work at the same time, I think it puts impossible pressure on the generation that should be having the kids.
No, I agree with that. And I thought that would really hit home. And I think like the point of having this conversation with you is that I know that there's a lot of guilt and shame for so many women who do want more children, for, the guilt and shame coming from cultural, I guess, propaganda that's just constantly feeding us with how we're ruining the world, or you're ruining a child's life because you're bringing them into this awful world.
Well, we have to make the counter case. I won't call it counter propaganda because I don't think it is propaganda. But instead of complaining about the propaganda, we have to make the case the other way, which we're all trying to do.
I think like the last thing that I'd really like to touch on is culturally anti-natalism as a whole, because I mean, where we live in the Northern Rivers, it's actually quite pro-natalist. It is very easy to take lots of children out pretty much to anywhere you go. People are very accommodating. Planes actually in and out of here aren't too bad. No one's complaining. So,
although I will just add, recently I thought I would just go for a quick holiday to see my mum who lives on the west side of our country. You cannot fly with 5 children as a single person. You can't get on an airplane with 5 children alone. You need
2 adults.
Yep.
Really?
Yes.
I didn't know that, because you could do it pregnant with 4.
Well, this reminds me of the story, it may or may not be true, of a woman getting on a bus in Jerusalem. And Israel is, we haven't talked about Israel, the one country in the OECD where people have a replacement level and plus fertility. And some families are very large. A woman's getting on a bus with her 8 children. and it takes forever. And the bus driver says, "Lady, next time you take a bus, leave half of your children at home." And she says, "I did."
True story.
I don't know. It's a feasible story anyway.
Oh my God, that's going to be you.
But I was honestly mind blown. I was so disappointed. I was like, firstly, are you saying that I'm not capable of flying?
No, but
Like, if we're going to crash, what's the difference between 4 kids and 5 kids? Like,
Yeah,
I can
we're
look after,
going
I've
down.
kept these kids alive out there on the streets.
I've also heard
I can fly with them.
I've heard of cases where you can't take more than 2 children unaccompanied to a swimming pool, for example. You know, one adult, 2 children. You can't go with 3 children. And there are things about car seats not fitting in, in
cars in general.
You know.
Like we've maxed out cars. They don't make 8-seaters anymore. Maxed. Yeah. So it's it gets difficult, and parking spots aren't getting bigger. So to get a bus, it's a big upgrade.
So the way, you know, that can become self-reinforcing, and that it becomes harder and harder to have larger families. So people don't. So the product designers or the people who write the regulations for the airlines don't care, because there are so few people who would fall into that category. So I mean, it could be a virtuous circle. If enough of us are having larger families, then it becomes more of an issue of getting custom, and you have to design. So ultimately, products and services are designed around the population as it is, and we do need to be aware of the danger of falling into that world where we have fewer children, and then the whole world gets designed around fewer or no children. I mean, as far as anti-natalism is concerned, it comes in different flavors. There's a sort of hardline anti-natalist. There's a South African philosopher whose name for the moment I forget, who, you know, has a hardline Schopenhauerian view of the world, which says, you know, bringing people into the world is suffering, and winding up humanity would be the kindest thing we could do. You know, that's very hardline and a bit weird. And you know, I think we have to respond to that, but that's not the most pressing priority. It's more important to talk to the green anti-natalists with a small n. That is people who don't necessarily think humanity itself or having children is a veil of tears, but at the same time think that we are not going to be able to make that compatible with survival of the economy, of the environment. And I think the answer there is to point out how much better people are able to look out after the environment now, and as they get more prosperous, and if our societies are falling over and collapsing because we're not. I mean, ultimately, yes, if there were no people, the planet would spin round, and there'd be plenty of place for nature. But there is place for nature and humans in abundance if we are young, inventive, and creative societies, and not if we're aging. Effectively, you know, a old age retirement home, a planet of old age retirement homes.
Yeah, it's pretty gnarly when you think about what the future's going to look like.
Yeah, I mean, it just is mind-blowing that, like, once you've said this and now that I know this, it seems really basic, right? Like, we could do the calculations, we look at it and we're like, yeah, I can see that happening. And yes, we're all having less kids, but, like, it's not mainstream. Like, it's actually hidden. Like, it's not out there, and it kind of is confusing as to why it's not mainstream.
Well, let's make it mainstream. I mean, I'm very lucky I've had the opportunity to go on podcasts like yours or Trigonometry that we talked about. Some of my podcasts have had, you know, 6-figure viewers, not because of me, but because the people who invited me on have got large followings. I've been given many opportunities to speak in the media, in the BBC, in the Financial Times. So it is possible to start changing this round. It's very late. It's very urgent. And we all have to put our shoulder to the wheel and do what we can. And hopefully some of the people listening to this podcast will investigate it, understand it, and join the mission to turn it around.
Well, bring back big families.
I personally might have a 6th baby now, so
she's pregnant
Good
already,
for you.
probably.
Wonderful, wonderful.
We're talking fertile ground right here. All right, Paul. Thank you so much for coming on to the show and for educating our viewers and making it okay for us to have 5 children each. We really appreciate
the validation.
Well, thank you, and keep going is all I could say. Keep going in every way.
Well, I'm an aspiring grandmother now, so I just keep honing into my children that they want more kids, and yeah.
Yeah. Well, never say never.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Nice to have you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Road to Wisdom podcast. To join the journey, you can follow us on Instagram at theroadtowisdom.podcast and at www.theroadtowisdompodcast.com. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. We look forward to seeing you next week with more juicy content.